Your Swords, presented by me, Timothy Ogoyette. I am the editor of an online webzine called Quantum Muse. We publish monthly short stories, weekly flash fiction. We also have a weekly discussion on the website. If anyone's an aspiring author, we also have an online writers group from which we pick the stories which are actually put out. If anyone is interested, we have cards up here for it. Just a reminder of how to get to the website. I'm also an author. I have a couple of books out. The first one here, called Lockdown, is a far future, military-ish, science fiction, psychological, sociological, hive mind, far future story. A whole bunch of stuff in there. The other one, The Light, the Dark, and the Quick, is a collection of short stories, where the light are the humorous stories, the dark are the more serious stories, and the quick are very, very short stories called flash fiction. That's a little bit about me, which begs the question, why would an author, editor, geek nerd be running a class on swords? And you've already learned that. This is I'll take a moment to look at that. This is a picture taken from the Manchester Union Leader, the main newspaper up in New Hampshire. I'm the one on your right, the one who's not holding a sword. This is in preparation for a tournament between the Seacoast fencing club from UNH and Dartmouth. As you notice, his sword is way past me, so he's not going to get a point. And the moment after that picture was taken, my fist was in his chest. The person on the left is John Wilson. For a number of years, he had this picture as his desktop on his work computer. Okay. In any beginning fencing class, the first thing we do is we go over the history of the sword as relates to fencing. So I've done that dozens of times. I've run my own fencing clubs. I've been an instructor. I've had, close to 30 years worth of experience in fencing. So I decided to learn a little bit more than what I already knew to run this particular class today. And the ages that the history of the human race goes in, at least as far as weapons, we went from the Stone Age to the Bronze Age to the Iron Age. And the first metal that was actually smelted was gold. And that was mostly used for ornamentation and maybe some small utensils, but was never turned into real weapons. The next metal that was smelted was copper. So I started searching the internet and some books and stuff to find examples of copper swords. The answer is, there are no copper swords, or there were no copper swords. Copper is a very soft material, and the reason that, and there were edged weapons made out of copper, the reason that there are no swords made out of copper is that the officials, and I'm not sure who's in charge of this, have decided that for it to be a sword, the blade needs to be longer than 18 inches. If it's less than 18 inches, it's a long knife. So the copper, because it's so soft, they couldn't make a blade that long that wouldn't crumple on impact. So the first swords that came out were bronze. As long as we're here, we'll talk a little bit about the different parts of the sword. Okay? Obviously, there's a blade, which has to be greater than 18 inches long. And there's what they call the hilt here, made up of a pommel, a grip, and a guard. Generally, when swords are made, actually the blade goes all the way up to the pommel. And it's just wrapped around here and other things are attached to it. Otherwise, if you had the blade end here, if you had a severe impact with it, it would break the blade off the hilt. In some very old swords, the pommel was actually forged at the same time the blade was, and was an integral part of it. Later on, it tended to be screwed on. When I was doing some research on this, I ran across some note that said that the purpose of the pommel is to keep the sword from slipping out of your hand. Yeah, which I thought that's actually ludicrous because that's, not what I've been taught prior to that point. As I thought about it, most swords we see today are pretty lightweight. If you had a heavy broadsword from the era of knights, it's going to be very, very heavy. And if you are swinging that with all your force, that's a lot of momentum pulling the blade out of your hands using centrifugal force. So there's possibilities there that could actually do that job. But the main reason for the pommel, or the most useful thing about it, is to balance off the blade. So you have this blade that's 18 inches out of here, made out of steel or some material. If you're just holding on to the end of it, it's going to be pulling your hand down constantly. So you want to, having that extra weight there means that the blade at its neutral position would be pointing forward, wherever your hand is. Think about it, you know, they have these handheld weights where you can swap out the weights. If you took the weights off from one side and just had the weights forward, you'd be constantly pulling your hand down and you'd be struggling to keep it up. But if you put the weights on the other side as well and it's balanced, it's easier. It's the same principle there with the palm. In fact, a well-balanced blade has its balance point right around here, just in front of the guard. So again, something I would show you if I was allowed to bring in equipment. You can actually place the blade across your finger and see where the balance point is. So you want to balance just in front of there because that gives you the most flexibility in using the weapon. Okay? We're still going over parts of here. The guard here is to protect your hand, largely. I mean, if you're in close fighting and actually hit somebody in the head with that, probably do some damage. We've seen that in movies. But generally, it's there to protect your hand. There's also something you can do neat with a guard. So imagine this is the blade coming out here and the guard up there. If the opponent's blade, if I get trapped in between those two, where it comes here, I can twist it and trap his blade between the blade and the cross of my sword. And then I can take his blade and move it out of the way. And while I'm doing that, my sword is still pointing towards him. So I can break it and then get a direct attack down before he can bring his sword back into line to try and defend against it. In fencing, that's called binding the blade. But it can be used in other weapons as well. All right, the guard, grip, pommel. For it to be a sword, it does not have to be double-edged. Many swords are only single-edged. Most sabers are single-edged. Most scimitars are single-edged. The advantage of the single-edged is generally you have a V shape coming down from the top that doesn't have the edge, coming down to the point, and you have all that weight at the top of the blade going down into that point. If you trim down the other end, that means the blade weighs a little bit less and you have less of an impact with it. Okay? But with double-edged, you can strike this way, and you can also strike back that way without having to twist your arm around.
Is ever used in battle or just for sport fencing?
The epee is a representation of the rapier, which is the dueling weapon.
Okay.
So the real-life weapon that would represent would be an actual dueling weapon. You seen The Princess Bride?
Yes.
Yeah, Wesley and Indigo. Yeah. Those were rapiers.
Right, but I thought the foil was more representation of where an epee was specifically a piercing weapon, just stabbing, no edge to it.
In the olden days, or in Europe, when they're actually using these weapons, the saber used in fencing competition represents an actual saber, actually a cavalry saber, but we'll go over that later. The epee represented the dueling weapon, which was edged. However, in modern competition, we only use the point. But back in the day, they would have had it either, came in many different forms, usually single-edged, and then an edge on the back of it for at least a little distance back, so that you can cut either forward or back. Remember, with dueling, we're just trying to draw blood.
Were there, I guess I misworded my question.
Okay.
Were there also swords with no edge, just the point? Are there battle swords of that design?
Not battle swords. There very well could have been in a royal court or something like that, but for actual battle on the battlefield, everything was edged. So yeah, advantages of different edgings. They almost always have a point. And the point, during this presentation, we're going to be discussing a little bit of metallurgy. We're also going to be discussing a little bit of physics. And we're also going to be discussing a little bit of what the blade does to the human body. So if you get queasy about any of those things, you'll recognize them when they start coming out. And the point here, the physics of it is you have your body weight, which is pushing the sword forward. You have the weight of the sword. And whatever you're using to push forward is all coming to this one little point. And from that point, that provides all of the momentum of your entire body, of everything coming into that one little point, and can generally easily cut through a lot of smaller armor, and also cut through the body pretty quickly, as far as using it as a thrusting weapon. So that's more effective. You get better penetration if you strike with the point of the thrust, rather than if you hit with the side of the blade. We'll be going into that a little bit more later as well. Little pommel grip guard, edges, and we'll discuss this grooving in the middle later as well. Actually, that comes up right now. During the Bronze Age, the bronze, even though it was 10% tin, 90% copper, at least in Europe and the Middle East. In Asia, they actually put 20% tin into it, which made it a tougher, stronger, but also made it more easily breakable, a little more fragile. Okay. With the bronze, because it wasn't as strong as iron or steel, if you made a nice long blade that was thin, it would bend, it would kink, it wasn't good as a weapon. So what they had to do was make the sword thicker so that it wouldn't bend or break or deform when they're actually using it in battle. But that made it difficult for arm fatigue. So if you're fighting, generally in battles, they may start at sunup and go till sundown, and you're down there with the sword trying to hack up your opponents and defend yourself at the same process for hours. And if your arm gets tired, it gets difficult to draw it up, you're going to be slower. If they have fresh troops come in, it's going to be hard to defend yourself. So one of the key features of a sword is that it needs to be light. And if they made it that solid block thick enough so that it would not deform when it struck something, and only sharpen the edges, it would be very heavy. So what they did is they took what would be that block out here, except for the edges, and carved it down into a triangle. Because of this thickness in the middle, that gave it the structural integrity it needed not to deform when it was hitting. But it still came down to a fairly sharp angle that it could put an edge on and then use it in battle. The other thing that they did with bronze was to make a central tube. Well, it's not hollow, it's a central bar. And then add plating to the side of it, which was then sharpened. The advantage of this is the bar gave you structural activity, structural integrity, and also allowed you to cut some of the metal out of here so the sword became a little lighter. There's two things about the lightness. One is the arm fatigue, the other is the speed of the weapon. So you take the sword and you swing it down, or you're going to do whatever you want to hit the person. The lighter the blade, the quicker you can come out and attack again. The heavier the blade, the slower you're going to be pulling it out and coming back for the next attack. So if you end up with, as you're in battle with two people, or in the middle of a melee, whatever it may be, as you attack and defend, if somebody can get in 2 hits for each other attack of the opponent, the one with 2 attacks is generally going to win. And we learned this from Magic and all other sorts of games where you take melee turns. Okay. So eventually the Bronze Age started about 3300 BC. About 1500 BC, iron came around. And we actually are still in the Iron Age, because steel is considered part of the Iron Age. But I wanted to separate it here because there are different properties between iron and steel and the swords that are made from them. And generally, when they went from one technology to the next, a different material, the first thing they did was to use the same shape that they had from the previous one. And this, so they started off with a diamond shape, but they found that because this material was more rigid, they could trim off the top and bottom points of that, making the sword lighter, and it would still be strong enough to make a nice long blade from. When we got over to steel, again they started with the previous, and then they started scalloping out some parts there, which is that groove in the middle of the blade. When I was young, someone told me that was the blood group. Apparently to allow the blood to flow out or something like that. Not actually true, and some people may use that term for it. This does a number of things. First, it removes weight from the blade, giving you a faster, lighter blade, which is important. It still maintains the structural integrity because there's an I-beam inside of this. You know what an I-beam is? You get this long piece, 2 pieces on top. If you draw a line from the top point here to the point there and here and across the middle, there's actually an I-beam structure in the center of here. So it maintains the same strength that it would. You need to interrupt, or you're just watching?
I'm assuming you're Tim?
Yes. Oh, good, I got papers. Thank you. Okay. So you get your I-beam structure in there, which allows you to have the same strength and rigidity that you would have here without the extra weight associated with it. The other thing that this scalloping does is, and here's again where we're going to talk about swords in the human body. On cheese knives and a number of other knives that are used to cut animal flesh, they're sometimes scalloped out of there. That's because you slice into it with vegetables. And cucumbers are pretty bad at this. You slice into it, the cucumber sticks to it, you pick it up and you go to the next one. It's because there's very little airspace, there's no airspace between them, and there's a suction thing that happens there. Similarly, if you're putting the sword into someone, if it's flat like this one up here, the human body's flesh will press down on it and will perform the same sort of suction that that you'd have slicing up a cucumber. And therefore, drawing the sword back out of them is going to take more effort and a little bit more time. Probably not a whole lot. That's where you're going to put your foot on their chest to pull it out. And if you're in the middle of a battle and it's taking you more time to pull the sword out of your opponent, then that's more time that people have to attack you while you're doing that. So putting that in there allows the blade to come out more freely, as well as reducing the weight of it. And then with steel, we were able to make even smaller blades. Some of them have grooves in them, something like that, that will have the same length and be as strong as the thicker ones would be, as we get to making better and better steel. So those are the three basic, well, those are the architectures of the cross-section of the swords. Yeah?
Have there been any swords made out of aluminum, or is it too flimsy?
Aluminum? No, there's never been any swords made out of aluminum that have actually been used for battle. It would be, and I'm not a metallurgist, so I don't know for sure. They may be used for, demonstrate, for to put them up on your wall so people can see them. It would be light, it wouldn't be as strong. So you'd have similar properties, I would think, to bronze with the aluminum. What do I know? There are actually swordsmiths in New England who make swords for a living, and some of them make battle-ready swords. So it'd be cool to talk to some of them to find out exactly what they do. Other questions over here? Okay. These are actual copper swords, I think used by the Persians about 3,000 years ago, or 3,000 BC.
Cut long necks.
What's that?
Long necks.
Well, that's right, these are bronze. So
Oh, bronze.
yeah. And you see they have that central ridge, that rod that's going through there, and the blades coming off from that. Here's another thing that's called a sword, and I apologize for the quality of the picture. I don't consider it a sword. This was actually used by the pharaohs of Egypt. This one had electroplating in it, which is a mixture of gold and silver. This is actually an axe. You have the arm that comes up here, and the thing that they've done is they've cut away the body of the axe here and just kept the axe head up there, the actual sharp part of it, and used it for hacking. But they call it a sword.
Is the whole thing technically a blade or something?
Technically, yeah. Although that's the only sharp part of it up there where the head would be. Here's some of the last bronze swords that were made or were found. This one here you can see has more of the triangular shape, and that one has the tube in it. Somewhat ornate based upon their style, and this one doesn't have much of a guard. The guard also adds weight to it, so some people may not have wanted it for that. All right, broadswords. When people talk about swords, this is generally, at least in Europe and the United States, what kind of comes to their mind as a sword. And the broadsword was a development in Europe based upon a competition between arms makers and armor makers. So in Europe, they started off with, smaller, lighter swords than this because they were fast and allowed you to fight. Then they came up with hardened leather armor, which could defeat those swords. It would be hard for them to cut through it. So they started making the swords thicker and heavier so that they could either cut through the leather, or they could actually, cause enough damage by striking them on the outside that they could do damage inside. We spoke about how the point takes all of the force that's being driven behind it and bringing it down to just one point as it's trying to shove it into an individual for thrusting. These things can thrust as well, so you'd have that force there. But if you're striking from the side with one of these, about that now or later. If you're striking from the side with one of these, all of the force, whatever momentum you've given it by moving it, whatever force you have into it, is going along a very thin edge. And all that force hits the body there. Even if it doesn't penetrate, all that force is transferred into the structure of the body. And if you hit them on the arm, you can very likely break the arm. If they didn't have any armor at all, and you're using the heaviest broadswords they had at the time, what would happen to the bone is it would shatter. So they made bigger swords that could either penetrate the leather armor or could transfer enough damage to break bone or make somebody incapable of fighting. So they started putting chainmail over the leather armor, which could dissipate some of the force coming in and could also prevent more of the thrusting attacks. So they made the sword bigger and thicker to be able to transfer that force through to be able to break bones and whatnot. And then they moved up to splint mail or scale mail and then to plate mail. And with the plate mail, really good plate mail, the sword's not going to do anything to you. And it's really expensive, and generally it was only the knights, the royalty who had the full plate mail. So they're pretty much impervious on the battlefield. They can kill as they want. Their only problem is if they fall down, because they can't get back up again without help. Everybody else was wearing pretty much chainmail, so everybody else was a victim, and those who were knights in swords, I hope, the knights in armor were able to slaughter them after a while. The plate mail ended because of two creations. The first was the crossbow. The crossbow had enough force to actually be able to shoot through the chain or the plate mail. The Roman Catholic, this allowed peasants to kill noblemen. So the Roman Catholic Church disallowed crossbows from being used. And then the second one was when gunpowder was brought in. That allowed anybody to shoot a musket and fire through plate armor. So at that point, the knights in shining armor just became big shiny targets on top of horses. So armor was pretty much done away with, and everybody went to light gear so they could fight faster and better, rather than being restricted by armor. And there was a period of time with which, as guns were being introduced, they weren't very good. And most of the battles ended up being fought by sword until guns got better and better. So the broadsword, as it grew up and got bigger and thicker, was because of the competition between the armor and the weapons. And they eventually went away with the introduction of gunpowder. Oh, pockets of brilliance. There was, I don't know if all of you know this, in South America, there were some tribes there that actually smelted metal. We know that we generally consider North and South America to be always in the Stone Age. I've seen some documentaries where they actually, pull out the metal pieces they were using to hold the stones together on walls. So they had the ability to portably smelt metal. But unfortunately, in each of these cultures, whenever it was known within this one valley how to do this, or this one little culture, when that culture went away, the secrets went with them, so that it never became known across the continents of North and South America. Actually, one archaeologist I met who found a stand cast axe head that was made by Native Americans. But as we said, it was lost, so the technology didn't become generally known, and that's what we call a pocket of brilliance. Somebody came up with something really great, it gave them advantages, it was wonderful, and then when that culture went away, it was lost. The first thing is Damascus steel. Anybody here heard of Damascus steel? Okay. It has this unusual modeling on the outside of the blades that they were used to make this from. Whereas most swords you see are nice, bright, and shiny, and that's what they were striving for in Europe. These weren't. But these were actually better. What was going on, and this is a metallurgy thing, in Europe they were melting their iron with coal and outside fires, and they could only get it up to like 2,000 degrees. And at that temperature, it doesn't burn out all of the impurities. So the metal itself has little flecks of other things in it, so that makes the sword weaker. It can break or deform when it's used to strike because of those impurities in it. And so they had to make their swords wider and thicker so that those impurities didn't cause, or the impurities in there were compensated by extra steel, which would keep the sword, in operational form. In and around Damascus and Iran, they came up with this technology, which we now call today crucible steel. It's a way to heat the steel up to about 3,000 degrees. And that's enough to burn off the extra impurities to make a very uniform blade. That allowed them to make their sword smaller, or at least thinner, it can be just as long or longer, to have the same strength as a broader one, to reduce their arm fatigue and allow them to be faster than their opponents. And so that's what the Damascus steel gave. It was generally only kept with, it was a military secret for a long time, although they did sell some steel to other places. There's evidence that the Vikings bought some steel from the Middle East of Damascus quality, even though they didn't figure out how to develop it themselves. And then when those cultures went away, this technology went away, and it wasn't until after the Renaissance, at some point, the Dark Ages, they lost this ability. That was brought to light. We do not know the exact formula they used. However, people have approximated it and been able to get this modeling here. As I understand it, part of this outside modeling is due to the way they heated and cooled it after they had formed the blade. So yeah, that made the warriors of the Middle East, it gave them a significant advantage.
Is that picture of modern stuff, or is that like...
No, this is actually old stuff. You can find pictures of it all over the place. Some people are, they've found ways to make particular patterns on them, so they're using the technologies of this to make funny things.
Very cool.
Yeah, and you can go online and find them. I went to Google Images and typed in Damascus steel, and it was actually hard to find the old stuff with all the new stuff out there. The other pocket of brilliance is a samurai sword. People familiar with the technology used to develop this? Anyone? Okay.
A little bit.
Yeah. I've actually seen this done on a documentary.
That's a recall.
What's that?
That one's not folded.
No, I can't tell from this. I'm just using representation. What they do is they take a block of steel about this big, about that tall. They hammer it down to it's about that shape, and then they cut into it until they're almost all the way through it. Turn it over, bend it back upon itself, and hammer it down into that block again. And they do this 100 plus times. And through that process, it changes the structure of the steel. Oh, out of interest, what's the name of the pastry? There's a type of pastry they do that with where they keep rolling it out, putting butter between each and phyllo dough. Yes. You wouldn't use that to fight with, but you can use it to bribe your enemies to stop attacking you. what that did was made this a very rigid, very strong steel. So they can make a very light sword that wouldn't bend or deflect. It also allowed it to hold an incredibly sharp edge. If you were to take the iron swords of the Dark Ages and strike one against another, you would put a dent in each one's blade. You do that enough times, the blade becomes dull. With this, you can hit many times without dulling the blade, which means you have to use less effort to get the same effect as far as cutting. And this, I believe the Japanese still do this. If you were to get a real sword like that, it would be thousands and thousands of dollars. Replicas are generally just spring steel, make you look like a samurai sword. But they look nice. See?
And if you look closely at the blade, you see a wood grain.
Cool. The other thing is the shapes of swords. And I thought I'd bring in here a couple of Chinese swords just for variety. And something would make an actual scimitar made with Damascus steel. Again, an old one. And our friend the broadsword. Here again, we're going into the effects of a blade on a human body. The straight blade, as we talked about before, if it's strong enough, it can, bruise and also break bone. In fact, if you were to take a nice sharp knife that has a flat blade, and you had a nice thick stake there, and you put the blade down on the stake, and you just push down, you cut through a little bit of it, and then the meat would tend to fold up around it, and you bruise it more. If you pushed with enough force, you'd actually be able to cut through it, but it takes a lot of effort to do that. However, if you take that same straight blade, put it at a little bit of an angle and draw it across the meat, you can slice through it pretty easily and make a nice clean slice. Okay? With a flat blade, in order to be able to do that slicing operation, you have to move your hands in particular ways, where you're actually slicing down or slicing up, which they're actually trained to do in not competition, but in actual battle, if you have a flat blade or straight blade. If you have a curved blade, then as that strikes the flesh, there's only one piece that strikes it, which is the point of, and actually in this arc that you're making of it, it's actually a little bit of a flat point on the blade. That starts to go in, and the rest of it is like a blade on angle, which is slicing into the flesh, which allows you to swing it flat like you would with a blade, but actually get that slicing action out of it as it goes into the flesh of your enemy. And we can see in a bunch of different technologies, this is a Chinese, I think it's a Gen sword, I forget. And this has the arc to it as well, so that it can use that same slicing action. Generally, the swords that are straight are used for thrusting. I think we discussed this earlier, where you can put all of your force into a forward motion onto the tip of that in order to drive the blade through whoever you're trying to have a nasty conversation with. So, curved or straight, depends on what you want to do with it. And other shapes that are interesting is the amount of force that you strike with the sword depends upon the momentum of the sword and how sharp the edge is. And the momentum is the speed times the weight, or the mass. So you can, if you have a long sword and you hit with the middle of it, you're transferring just about the same energy as if you had a short sword that had the same amount of material in it, you hit towards the end. So for things like boarding ships and fighting in close quarters, a shorter sword, slightly thicker, was a better choice. That's where the cutlass came from. So there's all sorts of choices in sizes and shapes depending on what you want to use it for. And sabers next. Sabers next, yes. Sabers, once gunpowder became available, or just a little bit before, and at least in Europe, the weapon of choice for military action was the saber. The saber itself, for the people who were fighting on the ground, the Marines, the Army, they had curved swords so that they could strike people from the side and have that slicing action work for them in order to incapacitate or kill their opponents. Straight swords were generally used by the cavalry. What the cavalry did with them is actually use them as short lances. They were actually trained. They'd gallop along on the horse with the point a couple inches off the horse's ear. They're trained to gallop at high speeds doing this. And what they would be doing is running through the ranks of the enemy, and they put their point down when they came to someone, and the force of the horse and the rider would just drive the sword through them. And as they continued forward, they would move their hand to the side as the body drops. And as they moved past them, the action of the horse actually moving away draws the sword out of the body, and then they would swing it back up and go for the next one. So they'd be driving through an army like this. So shape and size depends what you want to do with it. And how are we doing on time?
5:07.
Oh, this went a lot faster than I expected. Okay. The sword that we haven't shown you up here, we talked about this a little bit earlier, is the dueling sword, or rapier. As you've seen many movies with people dueling, it's generally with a rapier. In most duels, you're trying to draw first blood, and so you generally have double-edged up to the top, and you can have either full double-edged or one edge is fully down there, or full length of the blade. Those are more often straight as well because you're not actually trying to slice into somebody that way, you're just trying to nick them in order to have a duel. There's also knights. Did you need something? Okay, sure, yeah. They had, this is something else one of the other fencing instructors brings up all the time, or at least at the beginning classes. They had tourney knights, which is where the term attorney comes from. They had a lot of duels to determine who was right, who was wrong in judgments. It was used kind of like courts are now. And because not everybody was the same caliber of fighter, you wouldn't have a really great experienced fencer fighting against a 12-year-old boy who never held a sword before, or a woman. So the tourney knights are the ones who would come in equally matched to fight the battle for them. Meanwhile, the person who was being judged would be tied to a stake with someone standing there with a knife to their neck. And if their knight lost, their neck would be slit. If their knight won, they'd be released.
Where did that happen? Like what parts of the world?
Europe.
Sounds like really fair trial.
Yeah.
Who needs lawyers when you cut knights?
Yeah, you can each, fight. Abraham Lincoln was challenged to a number of duels, accepted one. Abraham Lincoln, we know, was a very tall person. The person that challenged him to a duel was an average-sized or smaller person. And if you're the person who is challenged, you get to pick the weapon. So Lincoln chose the broadsword, which with his height gave him a tremendous advantage over the guy that he was going to fight, so the guy backed out. Which also brings up one of the other things about swords. We've all seen these pictures of generally comedies of one type or another, where you have some big guy putting his hand on some small guy's head, and the small guy swinging his arms, can't touch it. The longer the sword you have, the better advantage that you have in when you're fighting against someone, so that you can hit them and they can't hit you, which is a wonderful way to fight. If you're the person with the long sword, not so good for the person with the shorter sword. So having the metallurgy to be able to make a strong sword that is also long gives you the advantage in the battlefield. And you kind of hold on to that technology as much as you can, because then they'll make something longer than yours in competitions. And you have arms races and swords as well from different warring groups.
Light enough that you can still match the speed.
Yes. So there's...
Ultimate claymore.
You want light? You want fast?
Committed to it.
The other, sorry.
No.
The other thing is the age of the sword ended. It overlapped the age of the gun for a while, probably up to World War I, where soldiers would, at least officers, would have swords with them, Sometimes the men would, especially in the Civil War, they had swords with them because, you're shooting very slowly. With a musket, they can fire about every 30 seconds, I believe. So 2 shots a minute. And then when you ran in to fight your opponent, after the shots are done, you pull out a sword and do that. Then they started affixing bayonets to guns. So the gun, that could be taken off and used as a sword, but could also be attached to the sword and used as a polearm or spear to fight your opponents with. And the early bayonets were swords. They're incredibly long. I have a Civil War era bayonet. It matches the classification for a sword. It was made in Denmark in 1813, I believe it was stamped as. Which I can't bring here because I don't want my hand. Okay.
Sorry.
That's all right. So yeah, and then the bayonets get shorter and shorter, and then they fell out of the classification of swords into knives. In the Vietnam era, they actually had attachments for a knife on an M16, and that's the last time I knew that they were actually using bayonets. After that, you're just using the gun and the knife is in your pocket to use that for close combat. So we started with bronze back around 3300 BC. They worked through iron and steel, and then it fell out of favor because a better weapon came to the battlefield. That's that. That's the presentation. What questions do you have?
What kind of sword is your favorite?
Good question. In fencing, I've had the most experience with foil, so I can do that one the best. The saber I find the most natural to fence with, and I can also fence with the epee. So I'd say the saber is the one that I prefer. Even if I was in a battle, unless they're wearing armor, I'd rather have a saber than anything else. Probably a curved blade if I had to fight somebody in real life. The samurai is a wonderful blade. It's even got the curving to it. Go back, can we?
Control V.
Control V.
Control V off doesn't.
Let's see. Apparently not.
Sorry.
That's right.
I can't. Ah, there it is.
There we go. That has a bit of a curve to it. It's very sharp. It could be a good weapon. The problem that I have with the samurai sword isn't with the sword at all. It's with the tactics that were used with that sword. Now, they have this type of Japanese fencing called kendo, if I get the term right, where they use a bamboo stick that has been sliced and stitched together as in place of the sword, and they wear the full armor, and they can go beat up on each other with it. And the philosophy of fighting with swords, at least in Europe, I can't say about the Middle East, is to kill or injure your opponent without getting killed or injured yourself.
Isn't that always the goal?
Okay, that's not the goal in Japan with the samurai. If you have the chance to hit your opponent in the head and kill him, and at the same time you can see his blades coming in and going to hit you in the ribs, which means you're going to be injured but you're going to survive. So you would let him hit you in the ribs for you to be able to do the killing shot. That's their philosophy there. The Japanese have some interesting philosophies about some stuff. At least they used to. They probably don't have it quite as much anymore.
I have to run to go prepare for the ceremonies. Thank you, and I'm going to come pick your brain later.
I'm sorry?
I said thank you, and I'm going to pick your brain later.
Okay, sure.
But I have to go do opening ceremony stuff. I will see you all there.
There's also, I've fenced with some kendo people, which was an interesting experience. This is a better sword than European sword. So in competition, which you're actually fighting someone with a saber versus this, eventually this could probably hack through the saber after you hit it enough times. And if you hit your hands or arms, you'd be maimed or dead a lot quicker than what the samurai would with his armor and you're hitting him.
What's to prevent you from using that sword with saber tactics?
Nothing. It might be a little bit heavy for one-handed use. But I don't know because I haven't handled one real one. But from the Kendo people, there were some strategies that are used by the European fencers that they've never seen before. The tactic specifically is called disengage. So, you mind standing up and giving an example here? Does anybody have any questions, or should I just keep rambling on?
Keep rambling.
Okay, stand over here, please, so they can see. Okay. Generally, in anything, there's an attack and there's a block. In fencing, it's called parry and riposte, parry, riposte, release. So if I were attacking like this, he would defend by hitting my hand up, like that. And then he's in line with his blade, and he'd come back and attack me, and I would do another block, etc. Okay? In samurai, they do that as well. They will block, and then they will come down, right? Because it's a two-handed sword, and the way they're using it, it always comes from the angle it's starting from. Okay? So if I were going to attack him, I'd come down like this, and this is a disengage, where I drop. Go ahead, I drop below where he comes to block and attack underneath the arm or some other weak point at the neck. And when I did this to a Kendo person, I just went, and he's like, "Where'd that come from? How did you do that?" I had to do it for him like 5 or 6 times before he realized what was going on. That's the French technique. But there are things like that the Europeans were doing that were sneaky and underhanded and trying to deceive their opponent. Whereas the samurais had their code of honor where they wouldn't do stuff like that because they're supposed to fight in a particular way. Everybody knows the way they're supposed to fight, and they stay within that mode. Thank you. So, I have had this question at some dojo I was at as to who would win, a samurai or a sword master. I thought about it, there's advantages to each one. The better sword, the sneaky underhanded tactics. And the answer I came up with is the best swordsman. So whoever can react to the way the other person's fencing or sword fighting better. So if the guy with the samurai is more reactive, can see what's coming at him and change his tactics to match the unique things the Europeans are throwing at him, then he would win. If the European was able to be able to use the samurai against him, be able to avoid the blade and use techniques he hasn't seen before and react to what the samurai guy is doing, then he could win as well. In fact, it was during this sword era that the U.S., when Japan closed itself down, wouldn't let any other foreigners in or out and just doing a closed society. And the United States sent a naval force to open China back up by force, or open Japan back up by force. And these tactics seemed to work very well against the Japanese. And I think they also had early muskets, which the Japanese hadn't seen as well. And a sword does not do well against a musket, except in anime.
Where it should.
Yeah, where it should. Swords, bullets coming at you, you slice into 5 or 6 pieces before it gets
That should
there.
be how it works in real life, though. Sword should be a thing still. Sword should be like a viable thing still.
If with a musket, now modern automatic and semi-automatic firearms, with a musket, if you can avoid that one shot.
Yeah. You can come back in. When straying from our topic a little bit, when the Europeans first came to the Americas, they had the musket. They could fire 1 or 2 shots a minute. The Native Americans could fire 2 arrows a second or something like that, or every 2 seconds. So even though they had this wonderful weapon which would kill if it hit you, pretty much. The musket balls are pretty big,
Also,
take your shoulder off.
Flintlock, they actually had to close their eyes or go blind when they shot. They shot and closed their eyes and pulled the trigger.
But the Indians could fire a lot more arrows at them within the same period of time. So at that point, the arrow is a much more effective weapon than the musket. But eventually, the musket developed into the rifle, and it became, the weapon.
Go ahead, I was gonna raise my hand.
If the infrastructure for cartridge firearms were to fall apart, what would you be looking for in a sword if you were if you were shopping for one to defend your life?
I would, as I said, I would go for a saber.
I'm talking quality, like it. As opposed, like you're not going to go to the mall and buy a saber.
Oh,
like because that's going to be one that's made to hang on a wall, not to defend your life with.
Right. There are some gun shops. There's also surplus stores that have old swords there that you can pick up pretty cheaply.
I know right now in West Springfield they've got a basket hilted Scottish rapier made by Cold Steel that's supposed to be battle ready. I currently I've picked up one by Windless Steel Crafts, which is also supposed to, other than being sharpened, it's supposed to be of a similar quality to a historically made sword.
There are people who are making what they describe as battle ready.
Right.
Which means they're probably using spring steel, which is good. You do need to keep a machine oil on it to keep it from rusting. And then it should hold an edge pretty much as well as, well, not the samurai sword, but pretty much as well as the other weapons.
You still go looking for antiques.
You know the quality of the antiques. I mean, unless they're rusted and pitted like that. First thing we saw, you know that it was made as a weapon that was actually being used, and could have actually been used. Whereas the battle-ready replicas, you can't be 100% certain about the quality of the metal that was in there. That's just my take on it. But if it came to that, I'd probably have a selection of different weapons. Of different eras. I like the idea of the belly bow. You guys know about the belly bow?
What?
The belly bow?
I think. Is that something that was maybe not? I think it was pretty big though, wasn't it? Like.
Yeah, what they did was, I forget who it was, but there was this one king who wanted to be able to defend himself from any oncomers, so he wanted to create the ultimate weapon. So he brought in a bunch of scientists and weapons developers, brought them inside the city, wouldn't let them go so nobody could find out the technology, but they came up with what they call the belly bow. It's basically a large crossbow. And in order to cock it, you wouldn't have the human strength to be able to do that. The string would stop here, and you actually had a place that you put your belly in, and you use your body weight to push the bow down to the end. And then that would lock in place. They put it in, and it could fire like 2 or 3 times the distance of any other bow at the time. And that worked great until, technology got out there and other people did it. We're about ready to get kicked out?
You don't have to leave. You can stay here and chat. I'm looking for somebody. But yeah, opening ceremony is going to start about 5 minutes.
5 minutes. Okay, yeah.
So jumping on his question, the repro houses, would they use a different quality of metal than a fighting, a classic museum sword, or would it be just the regulations, the safety regulations that would make the? I mean, obviously it is. I mean, you get something that's 200 or 400 years old. That's a museum piece, which may or may not be, a street. You may not be. I mean, if you needed to, you might have to use it. But if you wanted to make a repro sword into a street weapon, would that be possible? If what he said is so the gun industry went.
The thing is, as you're both pointing out, it all depends on the quality of the metal that goes into it.
Yeah, I would think so. Yeah.
I mean, even just basic spring steel for some places is going to make a good weapon for you.
Kind of like choosing a guitar. If you go into a music store and choose a Martin guitar, they've taken a lot of care in choosing the right materials and throwing away ones that didn't meet the system. Whereas if you go get a Fender acoustic guitar for $100, that they didn't put so much care in, you might still find a really, really good one that has good quality materials that
Or
they put together by
Ceivable,
accident.
too.
But the Martin, they spent more time and care because they knew in this case they knew their life was going to depend on it.
So, and the other point is the sabers that were used towards the end, they made millions of them. So literally millions of them floating around, and that's why they're cheap to get. And you can buy them on eBay for, I forget how much, it's been a while since I looked. So you buy actually some of the old weapons pretty cheaply off from eBay. You got to check your state laws as to what you can keep it in your house perfectly fine, but in some states you can't take it out.
Right. I've never been stopped carrying my claymore on my back, but you're not supposed to. Anything over 4 inches, I think, in Massachusetts, you can own it, have it in your house, but you're not supposed to carry it around with you. But don't feel any more badass than riding a motorcycle and a with a 6-foot sword strapped to your back.
Yeah. There's this one video of a motorcycle with sort of a sidecar bench sort of thing going down the highway where they actually have a full drum kit up there, guys playing, guys in the back with the guitar. Because that's, not what I've been taught prior to that point. As I thought about it, most swords we see today are pretty lightweight. If you had a heavy broadsword from the era of knights, it's going to be very, very heavy. And if you are swinging that with all your force, that's a lot of momentum pulling the blade out of your hands using centrifugal force. So there's possibilities there that could actually do that job. But the main reason for the pommel, or the most useful thing about it, is to balance out the blade. So you have this blade that's 18 inches out of here, made out of steel or some material. If you're just holding on to the end of it, it's going to be pulling your hand down constantly. So you want to, having that extra weight there means that the blade at its neutral position would be pointing forward, wherever your hand is. Think about it, they have these handheld weights where you can swap out the weights. If you took the weights off from one side and just had the weights forward, you'd be constantly pulling your hand down and you'd be struggling to keep it up. But if you put the weights on the other side as well and it's balanced, it's easier. It's the same principle there with the pommel. In fact, a well-balanced blade has its balance point right around here, just in front of the guard. So again, something I would show you if I was allowed to bring equipment. You can actually place the blade across your finger and see where the balance point is. So you want to balance just in front of there because that gives you the most flexibility in using the weapon. And then preparation for a tournament between the Seacoast Fencing Club from UNH and Dartmouth. As you notice, this sword is way past me, so he's not going to get a point. And the moment after that picture was taken, my fist was in his chest. The person on the left is John Wilson. For a number of years, he had this picture as his desktop on his work computer. Okay. In any beginning fencing class, the first thing we do is we go over the history of the sword as relates to fencing. So I've done that dozens of times. I've run my own fencing clubs. I've been an instructor. I've had, close to 30 years worth of experience in fencing. So I decided to learn a little bit more than what I already knew to run this particular class today. And the ages that the history of the human race goes in, at least as far as weapons, we went from the Stone Age to the Bronze Age to the Iron Age. And the first metal that was actually smelted was gold. And that was mostly used for ornamentation and maybe some small utensils, but was never turned into real weapons. The next metal that was smelted was copper. So I started searching the internet and some books and stuff to find examples of copper swords. The answer is, there are no copper swords, or there were no copper swords. Copper is a very solid. History of Swords, presented by me, Timothy Ogoyet. I am the editor of an online webzine called Quantum Muse. We publish monthly short stories, weekly flash fiction. We also have a weekly discussion on the website. If anyone's an aspiring author, we also have an online writers group from which we pick the stories which are actually put out. If anyone is interested, we have cards up here for it. Just a reminder of how to get to the website. I'm also an author. I have a couple of books out. The first one here, called Lockdown, is a far future, military-ish, science fiction, psychological, sociological, hive mind, far future story. A whole bunch of stuff in there. The other one, The Light, the Dark, and the Quick, is a collection of short stories, where the light are the humorous stories, the dark are the more serious stories, and the quick are very, very short stories called flash fiction. That's a little bit about me, which begs the question, why would an author, editor, geek nerd be running a class on swords? And you've already learned that. This is I'll take a moment to look at that. This is a picture taken from the Manchester Union Leader, the main newspaper up in New Hampshire. I'm the one on your right, the one who's not holding a sword. This is, we're still going over parts of it here. The guard here is to protect your hand, largely. I mean, if you're in close fighting and actually hit somebody in the head with that, probably do some damage. We've seen that in movies. But generally it's there to protect your hand. There's also something you can do neat with a guard. So imagine this is the blade coming out here and the guard up there. If the opponent's blade, if I get it trapped in between those two, where it comes here, I can twist it and trap his blade between the blade and the cross of my sword. And then I can take his blade and move it out of the way. And while I'm doing that, my sword is still pointing towards him. So I can break it and then get a direct attack down before he can bring his sword back into line to try and defend against it. In fencing, that's called binding the blade. But it can be used in other weapons as well. The guard grip pommel. For it to be a sword, it does not have to be double-edged. Many swords are only single-edged. Most sabers are single-edged. Most scimitars are single-edged. The advantage of the single-edged is generally you have a V shape coming down from the top that doesn't have the edge, coming down to the point, and you have all that weight at the top of the blade going down into that point. If you trim down the other end, that means the blade weighs soft material, and the reason that, and there were edged weapons made out of copper, the reason that there are no swords made out of copper is that the officials, and I'm not sure who's in charge of this, have decided that for it to be a sword, the blade needs to be longer than 18 inches. If it's less than 18 inches, it's a long knife. So the copper, because it's so soft, they couldn't make a blade that long that wouldn't crumple on impact. So the first swords that came out were bronze. As long as we're here, we'll talk a little bit about the different parts of the sword. Okay? Obviously, there's a blade, which has to be greater than 18 inches long. And there's what they call the hilt here, made up of a pommel, a grip, and a guard. Generally, when swords are made, actually the blade goes all the way up to the pommel. And it's just wrapped around here and other things are attached to it. Otherwise, if you had the blade end here, if you had a severe impact with it, it'd break the blade off the hilt. In some very old swords, the pommel was actually forged at the same time the blade was, and was an integral part of it. Later on, it tended to be screwed on. When I was doing some research on this, I ran across a note that said that the purpose of the pommel is to keep the sword from slipping out of your hand. Yeah, which I thought that's actually ludicrous because